Welcome, everyone, to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley, and with me today is my guest, Celia Stahr. Welcome to the show, Celia. I'm so excited to have you on the show today, talking about your book, Frida in America. I'm so excited for the listeners to hear more about it. Let's just start by saying welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks, Desiree. Thanks for inviting me on.
I am reading the book currently, and I am so amazed and impressed with the depth of research and the time that you must have spent on putting this book together, because it is just so well written, and just the citations alone. I mean, we'll get into that, but let's just start with you are a professor of art history at the University of San Francisco. So is that you always knew you wanted to get into art? You always knew you wanted to be a writer? How did all of that kind of come to be?
No, I didn't. I did not know I always wanted to write or be an art historian. I didn't even know what an art historian was. I didn't know it existed. It's something that happened gradually. I think I was always interested in music and dance. And then art came a little bit later. Mostly I was fortunate enough to go on a trip to Europe when I was 16 with a high school group. And I think that was really the first time that I started to really, go to museums when we were there and look at architecture and really think about it more critically. I don't even know it was critically, but at least in more depth. And it really just grew from there. But initially I thought I was going to be a psychologist. I studied psychology when I first went to college, and I really love psychology, but I wasn't that into the program. It was a little bit more behaviorist model, and that wasn't my interest. I was more interested in Carl Jung and the sort of the collective unconscious and symbolism. And anyway, it just evolved to the point where I took an art history class because I was told that it was African art, and I was told, oh, this is a really good class, you should take it. And I had an interest in African culture. And then I took this class, and it just completely changed my way of thinking about art and life in a lot of ways. And then I had the opportunity to go to Africa, to East Africa and South Africa, Southern Africa. And it just kind of it kept expanding in that way. And then I took another art history class, and it was a modern art history class. And at that point, I switched to be an English major. So I'd gone from, psychology to English. But anyway, then I took another art history class, and it soon became clear to me that this was my path.
Yeah. You mentioned the symbolism, and there's so much of that in the book. And I mean, I'm just floored by how much symbolism is in the art. And anyone who looks at art, you can, of course, appreciate it for just what it is on the surface, just being incredibly well done or whatever. But when you start looking at the symbolism of the things that are included in the painting, it's a whole nother level, right?
Right, yeah. Exactly. And yeah, you can see that I do love to talk about symbolism. And with Frida's art, there's a lot there. There are lots of layers, and you can enjoy it on different levels. You don't have to know all the symbolism, but I thought it was important to try to explore that as much as I could, because part of what I was interested in was her creative process. What was it that she was thinking about, feeling, exploring, and what were some of the important changes that occurred for her when she came to the United States in 1930, before she really had kind of broken into her mature style, before she'd really found her voice as an artist. And so I was really, I really wanted to look closely at what was involved in that process. And then, what are these different symbols in her work?
Yeah. And for sure, she uses a lot of symbolism in her style of painting and the things that she's including. And a lot of it came from the early interest in the communism and the Communist Party, but as well as a lot of Egyptian things, which I didn't realize, like the Rosicrucian Order and some things. And if anyone is familiar with the San Jose, California area, we've got an enormous Rosicrucian museum, which I actually happened to be a part of as a child growing up.
Oh, yeah.
So for me, that was a big tie and super fascinating. But yeah, she uses so much symbolism in her painting, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But what I would also like to ask you is, what was it that inspired you to write about her? her. And my goodness, how long did it take you to research? Because as I mentioned, the citations in the book, it's like so well written, so in depth.
Thank you. Thank you. It took me probably a little over 10 years to really research and write the book. Really, Frida inspired me to write the book. But what happened was that second art history class that I was mentioning that I took on modern art, I saw for the first time a Frida Kahlo up on the screen in the darkened art history room. And this is actually going back to the 1980s now. And there wasn't a whole lot known about her at the time, at least in the US. And so when actually I have a painting, a reproduction of the painting behind me here of, it's called Self-Portrait with Monkey. And when that painting came up on the screen, I literally went, oh, what is this? Wow. It really took my breath away. And I, on one level, I honestly would say I fell in love with Frida Kahlo and her work in that moment because I could not stop thinking about it. I left the class. Again, I'm not an art history major at this point, but yet I kept thinking about that work. And then we had to write an art history paper for that class. I was like, oh yeah, I'm doing Frida. And I loved doing that paper. I was just immersed in that paper. And then, many years passed and then I did become an art history major. I went to graduate school. I got out of graduate school. I started teaching at the University of San Francisco and still loved Frida Kahlo, but I wasn't thinking I'm going to write a book on her. But then what triggered it was I was teaching a class about artists crossing cultural boundaries. I had been thinking about Frida in that context. I taught her in that context. And then I had an opportunity to give a paper at a conference about women between the two world wars. And I just thought, Frida, she'd be fascinating because she's working between the two world wars, but also she was here in the US between 1930 and 1933, and how fascinating that would be to try to dig into in more depth because it is a cross-cultural story. But also, again, like I said earlier, it's a period when she really comes into her own as an artist and in many ways as a person. It was after I gave that paper that I started thinking about this idea as a book. But initially I thought, oh, no, I'm not gonna take this on. This is too big, this is for somebody else. But then it wouldn't leave me alone. Like I kept thinking about it. And then finally somebody said, I think you need to write this book. It really became, honestly, this is a cliche, but this is the honest truth. It became the book that I wanted to read. I was looking for somebody else to do it, but it wasn't happening. So I took it on.
Yeah. And that's what they say, that when something is in your mind and you just can't get it out of your mind, it's what you have to do it. You have to pursue whatever the idea or the concept is. Otherwise, it's never going to leave you alone. And I think so many writers say that about the characters that pop up in their head, right? This person in the book just wouldn't leave me alone. Like I had to tell their story. And so I love that that's kind of what happened for you with this story about Frida's life and the times that she went through, here in America. It is so fascinating, so incredibly fascinating. I've really begun to see so much of Frida everywhere I look now. And I think that there's another book that was written, and I want to say it's The Blue Feather or Blue Feather. And it's the idea that, something in your consciousness, it's like start seeing it everywhere. Everywhere you look, you're seeing a blue feather. Well, it was like everywhere I was hearing about Frida, seeing art about Frida, the book about Frida. And so now you're on the show and I'm just so tickled that we get to talk about this because she's so complex, right? And her life. So tell us a little bit about her and her husband Diego and their relationship, which you talk a lot about in the book.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, she is really complex. For people who don't know that much, I mean, she very much identified with the Mexican Revolution. She called herself, a child of the revolution, and she was a child of the revolution. It's true, and so the remaking of Mexico after the revolution, this new concept of what it meant to be Mexican really informed who she was as a person and as an artist. And part of that, as you mentioned before, was she really identified with the Communist Party. She joined a group of like-minded artists who were also involved politically with the Communist Party. And part of that was because one of the big issues coming out of the revolution was, workers' rights, trying to create a fair system for all, including the lower classes, the peasant classes, redistributing the land so that everybody could own the land. And so that's really important to who she was. And then it was an important connection for her with Diego Rivera, because he was a part of this group that she joined up with. And then they, of course, get married. He's an artist too, of course. So they have a lot in common. They're very passionate about life, but they had a really complicated relationship. And it was, it's hard to know somebody's relationship completely when you're on the outside, but at least from, what I could glean, yeah, it was quite complicated. A lot of love, a lot of intensity, but also a lot of strife and challenges, partly because I think Diego, he wanted so many different things all at once. And Frida was, they're both complicated, but I think that Diego was even harder to, it seems like, to be in a relationship with just one person and to really devote himself to that. And so anyway, there were lots of complications. But one of the things I did want to explore was that people often think that, Diego was just this, he was the one who was always having affairs, and Frida, just was the victim of that. But really, when you look at, what she was like before she got together with Diego, she was a free spirit. I mean, she, had lots of different, relationships with men and women. And I don't think it was just that she wanted monogamy and he didn't. That's way too simplistic. But certainly, they did have, this really complex relationship. And so when they come to the United States in 1930, he's the big artist. He's really well known. He's kind of at the height of his career. And as I said earlier, she hasn't even really found her artistic voice yet. She's still at the early stages. He was a lot older than she was. But then when they come here, she's not really known as an artist, but really by the time she leaves, she's developed quite a strong artistic voice. And there are people here who take note.
Yeah, for sure. And you explore all of that in the book. And I think it's just fantastic talking about the complexity of their relationship. And it wasn't, black and white. It wasn't, you can't put it in simplistic terms, like, he wanted this, she wanted that.
Right.
That's not the case. And as humans, we are complex, right? And so you talk a little bit about the psychology, some of that in there as well, because, they were human people. They had their hopes, their dreams, they had their desires, and followed through with those in many cases. It's just incredibly fascinating, and you do such a good job going into a lot of that, talking about the time that she was here in America and developing her art and her skill, and the people that she met, what kind of transformations that had on her as well. I think. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the process of writing for you, because as you mentioned, it was a long period to write this book and a lot of research. So tell us a little bit about that and how that was for you.
Well, so first off, when I had this idea, as I was telling you about this book I wanted to write, I honestly started to see the book before I even put any words to a page. And what I was seeing was her, on a train coming to California. I saw what she was wearing. I saw her getting off the train. I saw her interacting with it. So I saw all these things. And then I started thinking about how, I don't want this to be an academic book. I want to change my style of writing. I want to use the tools that I have as an academic in terms of research and understanding how to put, information together. I want to use my creative skills to be able to make connections between different, ideas and works of art, et cetera. But I wanted it to be a story. That was really important to me, because stories are more powerful than just if you read facts. And academic writing can be very powerful too, but typically it's geared toward other academics. And I wanted to write for a much more general audience. And what I really ultimately wanted was, I was hoping that I could write something where readers could see themselves on this journey with her. You know, you could feel like a fly on the wall, that you're on the journey with her, and that hopefully people would come to understand, you know, Frida Kahlo on a deeper level, her art on a deeper level, and also the time period of the early 30s, which is a very, you know, tumultuous, fascinating time period with the economic depression and a lot of other, you know, like racial strife that's happening, workers, you know, strikes, et cetera. And it's, you know, sadly, as I'm researching it and I'm getting closer to, you know, well, first when I started in like about 2008-9, we had the economic meltdown. And then eventually we end up, you know, with the 2016 election and all the strife that's occurred since then. And there were so many similarities that it was like, wow, this is interesting, but also it was at times very difficult to write because it was just too much like what was happening today. But anyway, I really wanted to learn how to write in a different style. So it took me a long time because of the research. Also, I had a young daughter at the time. And then also because I'm trying to learn to write in a different style. And I really liked creative nonfiction, where people, you know, writers use the tools of fiction, but to write nonfiction. And so I spent a long time just trying to hone my writing skills. I took a couple of online classes, and then I joined a writing group where we would read each other's work and then give feedback. And that was really, really helpful and challenging, because I can't tell you how many times I would get a chapter back and it would be all marked up, you know, and it was like, oh no, not again. But, you know, it was worth it.
Yeah, for sure. And you're right that the criticisms are kind of sometimes hard to take, but ultimately, if we use it in a way, so you're making your work better.
Right.
And you absolutely did make the book in a way that you're along for the ride. As you said, a fly on the wall. I feel like that. I feel like I am a spectator, you know, right there watching all of this happen. And so you did a fantastic job with that. I'm
thank you.
Thoroughly impressed and so enjoying it. I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk now a little bit about why the art is so important. Not just Frida's art, but art in general. Why is art so important?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And honestly, when I first started studying art history, a friend of mine asked me that question. Why are you studying art? What's important about art? And I was really stuck. I have to say, I was like, I don't know. I can't answer that question, you know, I'll get back to you on that, you know, and it took me a number of years to have a good answer. But I think art is really important for a lot of different reasons. One really is that, you know, it can open people's minds. It can open people's hearts. People are typically more open, honestly, to looking at a work of art and discussing it, even if there are some challenging topics or subjects. So, you know, and they've done studies on this too, which is really interesting, that oftentimes if you can have people look at a work of art that might deal with, for example, racism or sexism, you can generate a conversation that's a lot more open and interesting than if you just say, okay, let's talk about sexism. And so I think that there's something about, you know, when we look at art, and again, like they've done studies and they found that people tend to be more open when they're looking at the, you know, the artwork and then generating these conversations, which is a lot of what I try to do in my classes. But also, you know, there's also something that I think is very primal about art, because, you know, if you think about it, we go back to the cave paintings. Clearly, there was something there that early humans needed to visually create. And we're still discovering more and more about this, but it's cross-cultural. We find it in cultures across the world, and even engraved geometric designs on stones are up to like 100,000 years old. You know, the oldest cave painting is in Indonesia so far. We'll probably find more, but I think it's about like 45,000 years old. So, you know, it's been with us for a long time. So there's something very primal about it. I think a need that humans have to not only create something verbally or in the written form or a musical form, but also visual. Also, it helps us to understand the world. And part of what I've become really fascinated with too in more recent years is it appears that art is really good for us emotionally and physically, because again, there are all these neuroscientists that are studying the effects of creating art and also just looking at art. So like, for example, a Dr. Keimel at Drexler did studies, and I just love this. I found that just coloring in a mandala, okay, just coloring it in and then doodling, it actually lights up the medial prefrontal cortex, which is, I guess, the brain's reward center. And that's just coloring in and doodling, it's
Right.
Anybody can do that. And then also what I love is that making art, the same doctor found that making art for 45 minutes lowers your cortisol levels, which means it really reduces stress and anxiety.
Wow.
And so just, if you take 45 minutes a day to create a work of art, and you don't have to be an artist to do it, right? It could be anything. It's very helpful. And anyway, there are lots of studies like this, and, they're finding that, as I said, I sort of hinted at a minute ago, even looking at art lights up the reward centers of the brain. And also in these studies, they're finding that it's really good for the plasticity of the brain to look at art, to create art. And this applies to music as well.
Yeah, you made a great point. The popularity of the adult coloring books exploded in these last few years, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's like coming back to that, we realized how cathartic art is, right? And as you said, it lowers your cortisol levels, and it just brings you joy. It brings you back to that childlike, enjoyment of just doing something for doing something.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And I think Frida's art was very cathartic for herself, right? I mean, the things that she painted were the stories of the things that were happening in her life and the tragedies that she went through, and and all of that. I mean, wrapped up in a shell there. It's just how she dealt with the things that were happening in her life, right?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things, that certainly there are these events that are happening in her life, but then it's also, how do I take what I'm feeling and put that on a canvas? This is what it goes back to when I said I was fascinated by the creative process, because it's not as simple as just saying, oh, I'm in pain, I'm going to paint now. She went through a lot of different steps to get to the point where she created what she did on that canvas. And as we talked about earlier, she's drawing upon a lot of different, traditions in Mexico, European traditions she knew about in terms of art, and philosophies that she was interested in. So, there's just this like plethora of imagery and information and philosophies that she's drawing upon. So, because it's really hard when you think about sometimes, okay, I feel something very intensely, but what do I do with that?
Yeah.
I think that she was kind of a master though at being able to, I don't know, like encapsulate it really well, so that because people have such a strong reaction to her work. So that's why I say I think she really succeeded at capturing something also very primal in a way.
Yeah. And you talk about a lot of that in the book, in the types of art that she's doing and where she's learning it from, and, honoring the traditions of, her family and, her past. So it's so interesting. I can't recommend it enough. I'm going to just say everybody absolutely has to pick the book up, and we'll talk about that at the end. But so what would you say would be maybe some tips that you could share about the writing process and like what you learned as you went through that writing process?
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things I would say is, if you haven't written a book yet, I mean, if you've written stuff, of course, it's different, but if you've never written a book and you have a real passion to do it, I would say just stick to it, keep doing it, even if you get frustrated. You feel like, oh, no one's ever going to want to read this. No one's ever going to want to publish it. Just keep doing it. Keep doing the work, because it's so easy to get sidetracked. It's so easy to talk yourself out of doing something, because it is difficult work in a lot of ways. Even if you love it, it's still, it takes a lot of time and focus and energy and patience. And I mean, there were times when I felt like my brain was going to explode, because I was trying to keep so many different, ideas in my head and figure out how to, there's just so many small aspects to the writing process. So it's not just getting the writing down itself, but then it's, how do I make it flow from one chapter to the next, from one paragraph to the next? There's just a lot involved. So I would just say, just keep working at it. Join a writer's group if you can, take classes if you can, and then just, keep going. And then in terms of, if you want to get it published, there are lots of, avenues that you can go to now. There's self-publishing, there's what we call trade publishing, and then there's academic publishers out there. Sometimes, it depends on the publisher. With academic publishing, sometimes you do have to be an academic, but you don't always have to be. But that can be a little trickier. I really wanted to do trade publishing, and so I'd never done that before. I'd only done some academic publishing. And so for the trade publishing, you actually have to get an agent, typically. So that was the first step, was to get an agent. Then you have to do if it's nonfiction, you have to do a book proposal, and it's quite involved. It's quite in depth, the proposal. If it's fiction, you just write the book basically, and then you send out the manuscript. But again, for trade publishing, you also need to have an agent. So there are definitely, a lot of steps involved. And again, I think you have to be patient. You have to persevere, and just, try to enjoy the process instead of just the end product. And that helps me a lot.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that too. The differences with the trade versus the academic style of publishing. I really had no idea there was the difference between the two. It makes sense. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. And then, so you were talking about persevering. I think that I want to explore that a little bit more. What were some of the things, maybe, did you have setbacks during this process of writing the book? Were there things that, maybe came up that you had to table it and come back to it? What was the process like for you in that respect?
There were lots of setbacks and things. But, well, like I said, when I started the process, my daughter, I think, was in kindergarten. So there was just a lot there in terms of with her, because research is so important. There were lots of trips I had to take, but I'm also teaching at the same time. So juggling a lot, in terms of family and then my teaching. And luckily, like my husband when I would travel, he would take off work and stay with our daughter so that I could go off on these trips. Now, when she got a little older, like maybe I think it was about third grade or so, maybe fourth grade, she went on some trips with me over the summer when she was out of school. And so that was really fun. But all those things definitely slowed me down. It wasn't like I just had the freedom to just like, okay, I'm going now on this trip. Now I'm going on that trip. So that slowed me down. And then I also just, because of the time factor with writing, when was I going to write? I would try to set a time all the time for, okay, I'm going to write at this time, but rarely could I write during those times. Something was always coming up. And that's where I talk about, be patient, because I would get so frustrated sometimes. Like, I just want to write, leave me alone. Everybody leave me alone. But, life just doesn't work that way, at least for me. Maybe there are some people who are, able to just go off to their office and shut the door, and, their child never comes to ask them a question or whatever, but I can't just turn away. I can't just say like, oh, anyway, those were things that definitely were challenging for me. And then it just took time to get all the information. Like I said, I took a lot of research trips, constantly just doing research at home as well. And then let's see, also the writing process, what I was talking about earlier, just having to write these chapters and then get it done because it's my turn to turn it into my group. And it just felt like I was constantly trying to move in about 10 different directions at once. So
Yeah.
it was not a straight line by any means.
No, and life so rarely is just a
Yeah.
straight line,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Right.
there's climbs, there's falls, there's twists, there's turns, and it sounds like you just have to go with the flow, right?
Mhm.
It's this day I can write at this time, and that's all I've got. And yeah, there are the lucky few who can just say, I'm going into my office and I'm writing for 5 hours and don't bother me, but that's not typical, right? So it sounds like you just made it happen the best that you could, and you did a fantastic job. So
Thank
right
you.
on.
Thank you.
I want to talk a little bit about something that you had mentioned to me about something that Albert Einstein said, and that's imagination is more important than knowledge. So what does that mean to you? And why do you think that's true?
It's important to me because I think creativity is so important, and imagination is an important aspect of creativity. I think what Einstein was saying is that knowledge is important, right? We need knowledge. It's important for us to learn about history, about art, about music, whatever it is, right? It's certainly we need that knowledge, but the knowledge alone is not going to give us new inventions, new art, new music, new ways of thinking about things. That's where imagination comes in, because we need our imagination to literally imagine something other than what already exists.
Mhm.
And we need it on every level. We need it politically, socially, artistically, creatively, again, at every level. I think that the emphasis on imagination is an important one. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times we don't stress that enough in how we teach. I mean, at all levels, elementary, middle school, high school, college. And so it's something that I've really taken on in the last, I don't know, well, probably since I started writing the book, because I started thinking more and more about the importance of telling stories, the importance of using the imagination, and trying to become more creative in my way of teaching as well. And so I think the imagination is a really key element in all of this.
And I think that you're right when you say that teaching with stories is learned and processed and learned so much faster. And I think at like a deeper level than just that sort of textbook, here's a fact, memorize this fact.
Right,
when you're learning something in a story, it resonates deeper. I think that that's fantastic. Incorporating that into teaching.
Yeah.
Students would certainly be happier about being at school if they were learning in that way, I think.
Yeah, I do too. And that's what really hit me, was that I didn't want to just give my students these, facts or information that they had to memorize and then regurgitate on a test. And so I also became really aware suddenly that just the way I design my lectures and discussions in class, they're telling a story, whether I'm aware of it or not. Which artists I choose to show, which works of art by those artists I choose to show and discuss, which issues I choose to bring up and discuss, and how I frame it. So I started to become so aware that I am telling stories, even though I wasn't thinking of it in that way prior to the writing of my book. And so now I'm much more conscious of that as a teacher, and constantly trying to think of ways to engage the students other than just discussion, getting into groups discussing and writing. So, for example, I just had my students do something I've never done before. It just kind of came to me one day in a dance class. And that's how a lot of creative, ideas come to people, right? It's when you're not thinking about it. But anyway, what I had them do was to first write a portion of a stanza of a poem. They were looking at a work of art they'd never seen before. I wanted them to describe it, but I wanted them to describe it as a poem or part of a poem. Then they got into groups of 4 and they had to put their stanzas together to create the entire poem. And it was really fascinating watching them work together. And then they read the poems out loud and they were fantastic. I really loved it. It was so much more interesting to me. And they said I asked them, did you like doing this? And they were like, yeah, this was really great. So anyway, I just trying, to find ways to engage them that it's a little, hopefully more creative than what I typically have done in the past.
Yeah, that sounds so interesting. And I can just visualize the students, working together and
Yeah.
trying to figure out how they can make these pieces fit together like a puzzle
Yeah.
and create some whole new work of art, right?
Yeah.
As this poem. And that's fantastic. And I imagine that would have been really interesting to be a part of. I love it.
I hope so.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit now about the book is available. And I have to just interject real quick. I just saw on your Instagram that Selma Hayek was reading the book. And
Yeah.
if anyone has seen the movie that was made out of Frida's life, Selma Hayek starred as Frida,
Yeah.
and I think just did a phenomenal job.
Yeah.
And so I love that, she was, shown reading your book. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
So where can we find it? I love to read on my tablet. So I got it from Amazon, but
Yeah.
you can, I'm sure get it elsewhere. So where would we be able to find it?
Yeah, it's available a lot of different places. Barnes and Noble has it. A lot of independent bookstores have it. Books Inc. is one of them. Green Apple Books in San Francisco, I know, had it a while ago. If you look online, and also it was published by St. Martin's Press, which is a part of Macmillan, and so you can get it through their website as well. And lots of different places if you look online.
Sure.
But Amazon, of course, yes.
Absolutely. Nice. So I always ask my guests at the end of every show, if there are books that they have read or are reading right now, or maybe podcasts that they're listening to that have been beneficial or influential that you'd like to share with the listeners, is there any that you would like to share with us?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's always so many. I'm always reading a lot of different books at once and listening to a lot of different things at once. But this is not a podcast, but a TED Talk that's online, on YouTube. And I think this is one of the most powerful talks that I've seen. It's by the Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie, and it's called The Danger of a Single Story. And it's really powerful because she talks about how when she was growing up in Nigeria, which was a British colony, she was reading, as a child, all these British writers. And so when she started writing as a child, all of her characters were white and blue-eyed. And how she really didn't realize until she got a little bit older that, there are African writers. And then once she started reading the African writers, it just changed her whole world. And so the whole talk is about how the danger of the single story is that we don't see ourselves in it if it's only one story. And she talks about power dynamics, involved with who gets to tell the story and why. And of course, in this case, it has to do with the colonial context of Nigeria. But anyway, it's just really well done and very powerful. And then, another book that I just read that I thought was really well written and fascinating was it's called Girls Like Us by Sheila Weller, and it's about Carole King, Joni Mitchell, and Carly Simon, and the importance of these three singer-songwriters within the history of this genre and the impact on culture. And it's really well written and very, I don't know, like I thought, even though I know all three of these singer-songwriters, I'd never thought of them together. And so putting them together, I thought was very creative. And then the way she wrote it is really well done. And it's just, I think it's a fun read, but it's also got a lot of depth to it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. If people have questions for you or are interested in following your journey, like I mentioned your Instagram, how would people connect with you? What would be a good way to do that?
Yeah, Instagram is good. It's frida.in.america, at frida.in.america. And then I have an email at USF, that's CSStar@usfca.edu. And then I also have a a website that's FridaKahloJourney.com, where I also have a blog there and just information about the book and talks that I'm giving, etc. So
excellent. I'll be sure to put all of that information in the show notes for the listeners to take a look at. Celia, thank you so much for being on the show. It was so fantastic having you and having a chance to discuss this with you, because I just really am in love with this book. You've done a fantastic job, and the information that you're sharing is just tremendous. So thank you so much for being on the show today. I so appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on.
We'll talk soon.